Thank you. So next up we'll have Joe Mooney from Dublin Communities Against Racism. Joe will speak on the topic of anti-fascism and racism. Joe is a long-time political and community activist based in the East Wall area of Dublin. He's a founding member of the Dublin Communities Against Racism and has also promoted the establishment of Communities Against Racism in Ireland. As part of his years of activity, he's also been involved with local history projects in the Dublin Dockside areas, particularly focusing on the revolutionary, republican and trade union traditions of the community. He's also active with Dublin Independent Republicans and FIBI, Friends of the International Brigades in Ireland.
First of all, thanks on behalf of myself and Dublin Communities Against Racism, thanks for the invite here today. And it's good to see so many people. I'm a bit nervous to see so many people from DCAR and Kerry out there, so if I say anything wrong, I'm not going to get away with it. But I'll get moving quick. The first thing I'm going to say is that the topic of challenging racism in the current climate is a huge subject, and many of the points I will mention could merit a full discussion on their own. What I will do is I'll throw out some issues based on our experiences of the past 2 years or so, and I'll make some particular points. And given the nature of today's gathering, I'm not going to waste any time highlighting issues surrounding the fake patriotism, the flag wavers, and their links with loyalists or British fascists, because I'm clear where we all stand on that. Dublin Communities Against Racism was established after the sudden eruption of anti-immigrant protests in East Wall, where I live, which quickly spread to other areas of Dublin and then around the country. DCAR was set up to do exactly what the name suggests, challenge the spread of racist attitudes and racist activity within our communities, and oppose the rise of the far right and politically motivated racists promoting and manipulating these ideas. We were initially comprised of political activists, Republicans, Socialists, trade unions, etc. But this is very important. All of us were involved in community activism in our own areas. It wasn't just academic or whatever. Given the years of experience of all those involved, it wasn't a knee-jerk response. And from the very beginning, there was a clear political direction in their activity. And I'll come back to that later. Following on from DCAR, we also pushed for the establishment of Communities Against Racism Ireland to become active on a 32 county basis. And that's still a work in progress around the country. One of the first observations from both DCAR and Kerry is that different communities have different characteristics, and the tactics necessary to most effectively respond to the rise of racism locally may not always be the same. And this just reminds me to say that given the dynamic in the 6 counties, will be a lot different than a lot of what we've experienced elsewhere. The history of occupation, the cultural resistance and the ongoing presence of a hostile supremacist ideology should hopefully better equip the communities here to deal with the agenda of those promoting hate and trying to divide working class people. So I'd apologise if a lot of what I say is 26 county centric. One of the most important lessons to be learned from the events of the past 2 years is realising how quick the dynamic can change in any given community. My own area of East Wall, unfortunately, is the perfect example of this. We were ground zero for the recent surge in anti-immigrant protests. Ours would have been one of the last communities in Dublin that anyone could have imagined this happening. And I'm just going to give a bit of background just to explain how unusual this was. We're located in the Dublin Docklands, and it's an area that has a really proud radical history going back to the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which was practically born there. It was central to the Great Lockout, and throughout the revolutionary years 1916, the Tan War and Civil War, the area contributed more than its fair share, and it's something that locals are very proud of. The trade union tradition of solidarity is in the blood, and the community stood together in more recent years to oppose the bin tax, water charges, was courageous and to the forefront during the anti-drugs movements of the 1980s and 90s, and also challenged the corruption of the Celtic Tiger years and the gentrification of the docks. We have, in the community, we have a community Lord Mayor. It's a kind of gimmicky thing, but it's a symbolic role nominated by and voted for by local residents. The previous local mayor was Carmel, who was a woman in her 70s, known for her role with the youth club, football clubs, etc., and the anti-drugs movement. And in 2020, earlier in the year when everything erupted, Mohammed was selected. He's a local shopkeeper and he's a Muslim immigrant who was selected by our community as their mayor, not for optics or anything like that, but because he was a member of our community and was involved with charity fundraising events and the football club, etc. Not the kind of club you'd expect, or the kind of place you'd expect to be the centre point of a racist uprising, but it's what happened. Approximately 40% of residents could be described as non-traditional Irish. There was absolutely no presence of organised racists anywhere active in our area or even the surrounding areas. So what went wrong? In November of 2020, a large vacant office block was utilised as an IPAS centre, international protection, asylum seekers, with no engagement or even information sharing with the local community or the residents living in the apartment blocks within the same development as the offices. The response within the area was mixed. There was anger at the offhand manner residents were being dismissed. There were some genuine concerns relating to the suitability of the location, and other issues were whipped up by misinformation, scaremongering and ignorance. Responsible community representatives were unable to calm the mood, as we had no credibility to do so, because we had no idea what was going on either, because there'd been no information shared. Needless to say, the ideological racists and the far right used social media to whip up tension, and when the first coaches arrived with new residents, who are mostly young black men, it fed directly into every racist, inflammatory and apocalyptic scenario that they had been conjuring up. All this happened over the space of 2 or 3 days. Within 2 days of any indication that something was happening at the building, and of course all the secrecy, the wall of silence and the sudden arrival of the men, almost as if they were being rushed in because questions had been asked, angered people and gave credibility to the claims by the racists. An initial protest called at short notice at the site had a few hundred at it, mostly locals, and a week later almost 1,000 gathered, the result of intense mobilising nationally by racist and far right figures. A large number of these are from outside the area at this stage. Having gained an unprecedented momentum, the events of East Wall were used as a foundation block to spread and build an anti-immigrant protest movement, an electoral movement, and most importantly for the far right, a political movement. This has now manifested itself throughout the 32 counties, to such a degree that English fascists, Ulster loyalists and US white supremacists are all cheerleading on the Irish as an example to follow. Like, who would have thought we'd ever see that day? And this is all the responsibility of the Irish government. Despite guidance, support and finance provided by foreign sources, the Irish far right and racist influencers were very limited in what they could achieve themselves. They were handed an opportunity to gain an unprecedented influence in their communities, and they took full advantage. So, as anti-racist, anti-fascist and community activists, how can we respond? So, first of all, I'm going to say I personally would not dismiss any tactic providing it was likely to be successful, and that's important to say. Now, a physical force response is often called for by outraged anti-racists, and phrases like bash the fascists, etc. are thrown around. Now, I have no problem with that, of course. My first experience of anti-fascist action, the group and the activity, was when I moved to London in the 80s, and this physicality was an effective response to the National Front and afterwards the BNP and Combat 18. In Ireland too, there were examples down through the years. Some people here would be familiar with some of them. More recently, we would have seen, say, the very significant encounters outside Leinster House when the far right tried to organise, and again at a hotel in Enniskillen. These had an important impact, but these all took place before the upsurge in anti-immigrant activity in our communities. The tactical value of violent confrontations against committed far-right activists is very, very different than the tactical value of a violent confrontation of what can be passed off as concerned residents, etc. The optics are very, very different, and that's worth bearing in mind. Similarly, counter-demonstrations against racist far-right mobilisations must also be considered on the possible outcome and the long-term impact. Many counter-demonstrations have been very, very effective, as people know, at preventing racist gatherings or else rendering them ineffective or making them look almost farcical. However, the flip side is when counter-demonstrations become performative or counterproductive. There are many examples I can think of, and the most notable one for me was in Dublin. when there was a counter-protest called, which Dublin Communities Against Racism and others asked the organisers to go ahead with. The result was that the counter-demonstration was vastly outnumbered by the travelling band of racists and, more importantly, by local antisocial youths. And the counter-demonstration had to be protected by a line of police and marched to safety afterwards. They would have been torn apart if the police weren't there. Needless to say, trying to gain ground in that area has not been easy. I can understand the anger at seeing racists gathering publicly. I can understand the desire to respond, and it's important. But while emotionally, the hardest thing can be to step back sometimes and do something different. Long term and tactically, this might be the best option. Hard as it is to even say, but harder to do. In my own community, a very long and tiring process took place in response to the racist protests. As responsible local activists tried to undo the damage and divisions caused by the initial protests, while also challenging and undermining the message of the racists. This involved many hours over many weeks and months of dialogue and engaging directly with those taking part in the protests, discussing their motivations, showing how to address their concerns, and trying to raise the awareness of the political background of those leading and manipulating the events on the ground. And just something I should say on that is, as community activists, anti-racists, we never met any of the racist organisations, or we never met any of the racist leaders, giving them any respect for their groups or their position. We met our residents as fellow residents of our community, and we always made that very clear. I can't stress how difficult this was. Meetings took place on individual or small group basis, and listen to people that you've known for decades repeating stupidity and racism in your face. You have to have patience not to strangle them where you're sitting, and I didn't realise until then I had that patience. But ultimately, there were positive results. From large-scale protests at the beginning, it has now dwindled down to tiny numbers, and no protests now take place in our area. The biggest numbers they had in the latter part of the protest was about 30, and half of them were bus bin. Interestingly, the IPAS building is still operational after 2 years. It has over 500 people living there with no significant negative impact on the community, and now pretty much ignored by the racists because no one else is interested. Most of the community don't mind. One group of senior citizens, when they were asked about it, said we wouldn't even know those people were there if it hadn't been for the protests. Unfortunately, the racists did get what they wanted, a launch pad for their political ambitions. And just in case there's any misunderstanding in what was done, our meetings weren't secret or behind closed doors. We used every opportunity to highlight what well-known community activists were trying to achieve, including door-to-door leaflets, which included the very clear call to stop the protests, an invite for all residents to engage in discussions, and it also included a photograph of a number of local residents, including myself, who would be well known in the area, to show that we weren't afraid and that everything that we were doing in the community was 100% transparent. The importance of this local approach has not been lost on Dublin Communities Against Racism. We understand that engaging with those caught up or susceptible to racist ideas and the broader ideology of the far right is essential. Given the large-scale anger which justifiably exists towards the political establishment, and given that many concerns expressed by residents are reasonable and could be addressed, we must ensure that this anger is not misdirected and that genuine concerns are not dismissed. Too many on the left and liberal anti-racists labelled all those in our communities who reacted as racists. They failed to understand the need to separate those who might be saying uncomfortable things out of anger or frustration from those who were eager to manipulate these sentiments, therefore effectively abandoning people to our political enemies. As I said, DCAR was established with a very particular political focus. There is the anger in our communities, as I just said, and understandably so, with housing, rental and homeless crisis, the cost of living pressures, etc. It has been shocking to see how easy some people allow this anger to be manipulated and channeled towards asylum seekers and other foreigners, rather than at the government, the political parties and the policies which are actually responsible. DCAR's key slogan was and is, blame the government, not the immigrants. Successfully combating racism in our communities is not just about tackling prejudice. It's not simply about saying racism is bad, diversity is good. It's about us directing the existing anger and pointing it in the correct direction. I did say right direction, but it didn't sound good, so the correct direction. This is a three-sided fight. Our targets are both the government, establishment and the racists. Dublin Communities Against Racism has not been afraid to challenge issues head on, and this hasn't always been popular with Liberals and other sections of the left. We have held pickets at Leinster House and the Department of Integration to highlight the government policies that are serving neither the best interests of immigrants or existing communities. We highlighted the two-tier policy which saw Ukrainian refugees treated more favourably than others, and the perception that this created. This was really important. An impression was given that some refugees or asylum seekers were more worthy than others. And the fact that this in effect meant white refugees from Ukraine were seen as better over the dark-skinned ones was certainly problematical. A common quote from many protesting communities was, "We'd be happy to take Ukrainians." I have previously described this behaviour as the equivalent of a gateway drug, a pathway to increasingly racist attitudes, because people start off saying, yeah, we wouldn't mind Ukrainians, but not these other lads. Eventually you can see they've moved against the Ukrainians anyway. And of course, we have argued from day one that consultation and engagement with existing communities was essential. While this was not accepted by government, it was disturbing to see so many anti-racists and those on the left argue against this as well, as if this was somehow pandering to racism. Thankfully, it has been noteworthy to realise now that many more people understand that this is essential to dealing with these issues. In this age of social media obsession and short attention spans, the slogans of the far-right racists can be very effective. I think the slogan, "How's the Irish first?" is absolutely genius, because it's so simple. Given the housing and accommodation crisis, who could be seen to disagree with that idea? Everybody knows somebody, every family has members affected by the shortage and affordability issues and wants a solution for their own families, relatives and friends. So some people can feel comfortably non-racist and say, yes, I welcome refugees, but let's look after our own first and then do what we can. I've heard self-professed socialists fly that kite too. The problem is that this is politically damaging, as it obscures the fact that the housing crisis has not been caused by accident, not by failure of the government, but by design, by the ideological decisions and policies of our government parties. So from a straightforward class-based perspective, once you even begin to equate immigration numbers with housing issues, you allow that to shape the debate and are already falling into a political trap. 2 pages to go. And I'm going to wrap up with a dire prediction. As the cliche goes, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Throughout the 1970s, the National Front in Britain had grown in influence within sections of the working class who had bought into their anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-Irish racism as well, as we know. As the election date approached that year, the Tory party increased their own racist messaging and presented immigration policies in line with the issues and demands being popularised by the National Front. This was a winning approach, as many who had been convinced by the National Front rebel rousers that foreigners were the source of all their woes, voted Tory. They believed the racist rhetoric. However, like most decent people, they didn't feel comfortable with the hooliganism nor the skinhead boot boy image of the National Front, but were prepared to support the more respectable seeming Conservative Party to get the same result about immigration that they wanted. The Tories achieved an historic victory that year, and I hate to mention the name, but that's when Margaret Thatcher came to power. And unfortunately, we all know how that worked out for the British working class and the Irish working class. So, as with the Tories in Britain in the 1970s, the Irish mainstream is happily adopting the anti-immigration agenda to boost their own election campaigns. This has involved the so-called get tough attitude expressed in numerous ways, cracking down on the tent cities in Dublin, because these guys have absolutely nowhere else to live. Talk of chartering planes to facilitate mass deportations, as if that could even happen. All feeding into the successful racist branding of all foreigners as illegals and undesirables, a deliberate dehumanisation and scaremongering ploy. And we've recently seen Taoiseach Simon Harris directly link immigration with homelessness, employed to shift blame from the government records. And there's countless examples now, Leo Varadkar, etc., going down this path. So in addition to the government adopting these attitudes, let's not forget that in the past 2 years, the far right and racists have been targeting the opposition parties rather than the government. they've targeted people before profit, progressive independence, they've targeted everybody, and that includes Sinn Féin. This included the relentless branding of Sinn Féin as traitors, open border lunatics, etc., etc. They're not calling Sinn Féin traitors based on any Republican principles, they're calling Sinn Féin traitors because they say they brought the foreigners in, they're part of the agenda to change Ireland. 2 years ago, all the talk was of Sinn Féin in government in the south. Now only a madman would think that's even possible. The next government down south, and this is my dire prediction unfortunately, the next government down south will certainly be Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil again, with some mudguards to make up the numbers. Some of those who will vote for them will be working class people who bought into the anti-immigrant message, don't like the drug dealers, the anti-social thugs, etc. at the forefront of that movement, but might just trust Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael to get the job done regarding their concerns about immigration. And once the main government parties get a renewed mandate, it's guaranteed that their policies will be more of the same, there will be no let up in the housing crisis, and working class communities will continue to suffer. That was my dire prediction. Our task is about ensuring that racism and xenophobia are not used to further divide the working class, and to work tirelessly to direct our communities to both challenge the government agenda and also to challenge the useful idiots and the controlled opposition that the far right actually are. And at the kind of slope popularised by decar activists, we must remain anti-racist and anti-establishment. Thank you.